All right, hello everybody. This is going to be a slightly longer lecture today on craft media. All right, so learning objectives for the craft lecture. First, I'm going to characterize the difference between craft and fine art. This is a really important question that many contemporary theorists dabble with. Second, we're going to describe the different ceramic methods and materials. Ceramics is an important type of craft media. And then we're going to outline some ways in which glass has become an artistic medium. And at the end, we'll describe some of the different uses of fibers in the arts. So here's this important question that I think uh, is good to start with. And actually, when I taught this lecture in class on Tuesday, we actually had a very extensive discussion about this. What is the difference between art and craft? So when you think of craft and when you think of art, what are the key differences that you find emerge? A lot of folks in my class that I taught on Tuesday first started thinking about not just the medium, but the people who make these things, right? They were thinking about talent, and they also thought a lot about skill. And so they, in their minds, art seemed to necessitate some sort of skill which craft did not necessitate. And I think for many of my students, we talked about children's crafts too, and how, for instance, one of my students brought up, well, the Mona Lisa, right, by Leonardo da Vinci, would be fine art. But if a child made like a replica of the Mona Lisa out of macaroni, right, that's a craft. And so there was a lot of talk about like children's crafts, and I totally get that, and that's the way that we oftentimes think of the word craft within our culture, is that it's art and crafts. It's, send your kids to craft school after well, not craft school, but send your kids to some sort of craft camp that's right after school or something like that. And that's a way for children to become creative, right? But here, when we think about craft as a fine art form, we see something a little bit different. And if you read your book this week, this is the definition that your book really offers, and I think it's really nice. So craft media are often distinguished from fine arts because they make functional objects. So there's a real interest in the functionality of the object when we're thinking about craft media. If a work is primarily meant to be used, it can be classified as a craft. Conversely, if it is meant to be experienced or seen, that is, if its use is for aesthetic purposes, it may be classified as art. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. So here we have a few artists. Junko Shonobari, I'll just mention him for a second here at the bottom. He is a fine artist who works in the medium of craft. Because he uses fabric and fibers oftentimes within his work, and those are specifically craft media. And so he uses these fabrics to create these elaborate outfits that go on often headless mannequins. And actually the whole thing is a much broader kind of comment on colonialism and post-colonialism in Africa. But I think we'll try to get to that way at the end of today's lecture. So it's really nice to start, and this is kind of the way that your book starts as well. When we think about this distinction between craft and fine art, we can see that craft can be fine art, right? This is a question that we like to ask too, is there overlap between the two? And many of my students had a hard time with this. Many of them said that there can't be, and then a few of them said there can be. So here we have an artist, Josiah Wedgwood, who really allows us to see how those lines can be slightly blurred within the work. So here we have kind of some early dinnerware from the 1790s. He created what he would call ornamental ware, and then a separate set of dinnerware would be called useful ware. So the latter was able to be manufactured quickly and efficiently. This shows you the latter. This shows you what he would call the useful ware. And then this established his reputation. It also established his business in terms of monetary funding. So he had enough money to create the more artistic type of work that he created, which he called ornamental ware, which we see here. So the ornamental ware is a little bit different, right? It's still useful, okay? It's still functional. It's a vase, so it's still within the category of craft. But I think that we would say that it is also a fine art form because you see he's referencing the fine art of ancient Greece. He's looking to this early kind of crater, which also we could think about in terms of craft, because this also would have been useful. This would have been used to carry some sort of food or perhaps wine. And so he works here with the imagery that he sees on those ancient Greek vases in low relief. Remember, we've talked about low relief before. And he creates something that kind of um, this kind of eliminates the boundary, if you will, of art and craft. So now when we talk about ceramics, ceramics is another important medium where we see a lot of craft objects being created. Ceramic objects are either flat or hollow. We talked about sculpture last time, so we already talked a little bit about ceramics, so I won't go into too much detail here. But here we've got a couple different types of construction. So we've got slab construction, coiling, and then also the construction through the use of the potter's wheel. And pieces, it's important to note that pieces are oftentimes glazed, and this is basically a way to make the clay that you're using to create the ceramic piece different colors, okay? But it also protects the clay from the growth of bacteria and different natural elements as well. So the first method of construction here is slab construction. You can see slab construction oftentimes creates these kind of minimalist ceramic objects here. In this method, you basically just roll out the clay into, like you would a pie crust or a pizza crust or something, into a flat slab, and then you go ahead and shape whatever you're making by hand using that slab. And so here you see a tea bowl. And these tea bowls were highly prized in Japan because of their uniqueness and their ability. They were very small, so they had the ability to fit in one's hand. And you can see here the use of slab construction very easily. This piece that would go completely around like this would actually just be one slab affixed to a bottom slab. Here we have another method called coiling. So if anyone's taken a ceramic class in high school, which I know I had to, coiling is one of those kind of very accessible modes of creating ceramic pieces. So basically you'd just coil the clay, as you can see here, and once you have your kind of thin coil, you'd find a base, right, a slab that you'd use for the base, and then you begin coiling this kind of rope-like a piece of clay in a circle, building up the ceramic pot. You can see here a vase is being created, and you'd put what we call a slit, kind of a glue in between, and it's basically just made out of clay and water in between each one of the kind of layers, and then those would kind of fuse them together so that when you're done, you can go ahead and smooth the outside, blending it together, and you can make the outside completely you can eliminate the seams and the lines completely with your hands if you'd like to. And the last way that we oftentimes see ceramics created is through the use of the potter's wheel. So the potter's wheel was developed in ancient Egypt. This is where we find the early uses of the technique. So a flat disc attached to a flywheel is kicked by the potter to make it turn. Nowadays, if you go to a ceramics class, you oftentimes have a pedal that you just kind of press down on, and that creates the turning of the wheel as well. So as the slab of clay turns, the potter pinches the clay between the finger and the thumb, the first finger usually, or all the fingers, depending on the technique. And then you can create whatever kind of round symmetrical shape that you're trying to create, both inside and outside of the object. And here you can see kind of a better example. So you start with a very, very malleable, very soft piece of clay. And then as you move the wheel, and here you're actually using a lot of this slit, a lot of that kind of mud, clay filled mixed with water as you start to work the object with your fingers, and then you can see the finished product here. I was never very good at this in high school, so I never really liked the potter's wheel. All right. So we also have the use of porcelain, which we can always also characterize as a craft medium. We see early uses of porcelain in the Ming Dynasty in China. Artists painted elaborate designs, and they oftentimes use this the blue and white kind of pattern that we see here on the piece on the plate over at the right hand side. And this actually became very popular within European cultures as well as Islamic cultures. And so these were actually very prized pieces. If you think about, how we talk about China today, right? These very prized pieces of China oftentimes come from China. These are the types of dinnerware that are often not used, right? They're so valuable that we keep them in cabinets away from anybody who might want to use them or break them. But this is where we see that early obsession with this kind of dinnerware as a commodity coming from. But more contemporary artists are also working within this framework and using the long history of kind of Chinaware and porcelain and this blue on white kind of print that we oftentimes had in the early Ming Dynasty's work. So Julie Green is one of these artists, and here she's kind of using her ceramics as a form of politics. So this work is called The Last Supper. It's from 2000, and I actually want to show you this view first. So this is an installation view. You can see just how huge this piece is. So it spans not only this central wall, but also a variety of other walls in the gallery space. So there's hundreds of plates. You can see here I've written 283 plates in 2008 when she exhibited this, but the project, as you can see here, is ongoing. So it started in 2000, and by 2008, when she exhibited it here, where we have the installation view, she had 283 plates created, but now she's got much, much more. So let's actually talk about these a little bit. All right, so what do we see here on the plates? So Green depicts the menu requested for the last meal of individuals living on death row to draw attention to how many Americans are executed each year. So clearly this is a political work that has much to do with the abolition of the prison complex and the death sentence, right? She's wanting to show us just how many people are put on death row each year and how many people are executed. And so every time, each one of these plates actually documents someone's last meal for someone who was on death row. So she also references the blue color on the plates she uses the blue color on the plates to reference religion as well. So she's looking to this Ming Dynasty tradition, but she's also using this blue color because it very much signifies for her the Virgin Mary, because this is the color that is reserved for the Virgin Mary by Pope Pius, okay? And when you think about Virgin Mary, right, you oftentimes think of her as wearing like this blue gown, a blue shroud of some sort. So each plate is titled by the state. So there's each state you can see here. Here we have Georgia. I can't read these very well, but I know that this one is Georgia. This one is Texas, and then this one looks like it's Indiana. And so she gives us the state of execution as well as the date. And she leaves the inmates off the pieces. So these are actually very anonymous. They only have the date and then the state listed on within each plate. And then you can see, this person's last meal was they wanted some pie, pizza, ice cream, burgers, and Dr. Pepper. So she initially wanted these to be very institutional looking, kind of referencing the institution, right, of the prison. But instead they became much more painterly, and you can see here so if you were to look at the piece in its entirety, you'd see a shift in style where she started a slightly more traditional and then became slightly more painterly over the years. So glass is another important medium that we oftentimes see categorized as craft. So glass blowing techniques, innovated in the first century before the Common Era, allowed for a major industry in the Roman world, and that industry was mosaics, so glass mosaics. And where do we see these? Well, especially in the ancient Roman world, we see these in churches. Okay, but we also see a lot of other glass blowing for a variety of different reasons. Here you can see this kind of beautiful glass bowl, which would have been used in kind of an imperial kitchen of some sort. We have the melting of glass chips to create kind of these different colors. And now it looks something that was created in like the 60s or 70s, right? Now it looks like these colors are kind of psychedelic. But actually, this is from, 25 before the Common Era, so before even the year zero. But even more importantly, I'd say we've got the use of blown glass to create stained glass windows in cathedrals. And this is where we really see glass coming to the fore in the ancient world. Not the ancient world, but especially, I guess I would say, in the I would say at the end of the Middle Ages, and so especially when we move to the Gothic era, where we have cathedrals that are getting taller and taller and taller, and the walls are becoming thinner and thinner and thinner to allow more light to enter into the space. So here we have the Church of Saint Denis, and it's an abbey church. And the Abbot Suger, looks like his name is Sugar, but it's actually pronounced Suger. And he was really interested in stained glass because he believed that a church must have a divine light manifesting kind of the spirit of God, so that when people entered that they would feel that immediately. So we enter into this space, and this is what you'd see is basically all the walls have been removed and replaced with these amazing stained glass windows. And this could happen because of like the techniques that started to be what's the word I'm looking for, that were being used, I guess, used at the time to make the walls thinner so that we have what we call external buttresses, otherwise known as flying buttresses, which exist outside of the central space. And so if you were to see this cathedral from the outside, there's actually giant supports which lift the weight of this huge ceiling at the top outside of the structure itself, allowing the windows to actually make up the walls of the space here at Saint Denis. We've also got, there's an important artist who many of you might have heard of. He's become kind of a pop culture reference. His name is Dale Chihuly. If any of you have been to Las Vegas and perhaps been into the Bellagio Hotel, you'd walk into the space and you look up and you see here this amazing work of art by Dale Chihuly, who's a glass-blowing artist. He's become very famous. We see his works a lot in public spaces and also within nature. And so here we have one of his pieces in the Botanical Gardens in Dallas from 2012, where he basically installed his giant glass pieces right into the natural landscape. All right, moving on to fibers. So fibers are basically the use of fibrous material in the creation of art objects and environments. So basically we have the use of thread, yarn, burlap, dyed fabric, felt, wool, paper, etc. to makes up the category of fibers within the category of craft. So oftentimes you'll see people stitching, crocheting, I would say also embroidering, knitting, weaving, dyeing, coiling, wrapping, all these things. But fibers is not a contemporary art form. Fibers go all the way back to wall hangings, from European wall hangings in the Middle Ages. So here we have a wall hanging where we see a unicorn in captivity. And this would have been hung on castle walls within the during the Middle Ages. And this would have been not only a decorative device, a beautiful piece of decoration, but it also would have warmed the walls. You know, these are parts of Europe where we actually have France, right, where we have it gets pretty cold. You know, it actually gets cold in the winter. So all the A lot of the castles at this time, these cold castles, would have had these amazing tapestries, these wall hangings, not only for decoration but also for warmth. So how was a tapestry made? How was a weaving made? Well, basically, we have the interlacing of horizontal and vertical threads. And so here you have a warp coming this way, up and down, and then what we call a weft from the side, this piece that would go in and out, in and out, in and out as you move up the weaving. So oftentimes you can see tapestries are created in a couple of ways. So artists oftentimes use what we call a loom. People can home make looms, so you have little handheld looms like this one pictured here, where you see that the artist or maybe the crafter has just been moving the thread in and out, in and out, in and out of these vertical threads that are strung across the loom, and then you have one of these larger looms that actually works with the body in a different way at a much larger scale, and everything is kind of input, and then the machine helps you do the work. Embroidery is another type of fiber work, and this is basically the use of needlework. And so oftentimes there's a variety of different techniques that are used. Here you see a few different techniques of needlework, different types of knots. These are called French knots. All these different ways of using thread to embroider color into a surface. And again, embroidery is not a new thing necessarily. Here we have kind of an Indian rumal. We'd call this a rumal. And this is an embroidered muslin textile, which would have been used for wrapping gifts. So nowadays we have wrapping paper, right, that we go to the store and we buy it. It's printed with some sort of design on it. But in the late 18th century, we had in India, this is the type of wrapping paper you'd get if you were receiving a gift. This would have been for a gift for a wedding. The composition suggests that, because here we see a scene of a wedding. And this whole thing actually would have been, is embroidered and would have wrapped a gift. So you would have received your gift in a beautiful embroidered textile like this. Another thing I wanted to bring up briefly, and this is something your book does not talk about, is dyeing. I'd say this is another important craft media as well. And this is just basically, I guess the easiest thing, the easiest way to think about this is tie-dyeing, right? Every one of us is probably tie-dyed. It's something that you do when you're a kid for fun. And so you've probably dyed some sort of fabric. Well, these are slightly more I guess, artistic than that, right? We actually have very specific dyeing kind of processes that are happening. This one, for example, is called shibori. It's this beautiful kind of wave-like dye, and this is how you would actually do it. You would use a piece of piping here, and then you would squish the fabric down and put a variety of rubber bands around it and dye the fabric. I just wanted to mention this too, because artists are dyeing fabrics in important ways as well. And here we can see this is also seen as craft media. And now just to touch on the Yinka Shonibari, he's one of these artists who uses craft media, but he's also very interested in politics, colonialism and post-colonialism. As I said earlier, he's an artist who was raised in Nigeria, but now he lives in Great Britain. He went to art school in Great Britain as well. He creates these hybrid clothes with West African fabrics and Western design. But really, if we look closely, these fabrics are called Dutch waxed fabrics. And so here we see Dutch wax cotton prints. And so what's actually going on here? Well, if you look closely, this piece is called Scramble for Africa. If you look closely, if you think through any classes you've taken in any history classes you've taken, you might recall, what do I mean? What does he mean when he's referencing Scramble for Africa? What's happening here? Well, here at the center of the table, you see a map of Africa, and then there's a series of headless mannequins centered around the table. They seem to be in some type of debate. And so this is actually referencing the Berlin Conference, which was a conference where all of the European powers came together in the 1800s to fight over the African continent and to divide it up amongst themselves, because there's this idea in their minds that no one occupied Africa, and that they could take it because it wasn't, no one lived there already, right? There's this idea that people didn't live there, even though clearly they did, right? If you know anything about Egyptian art, right? Egypt is in Africa. We know that the people lived there long before any type of European history has been recovered. So basically, it's problematic, right? We have this conference where all the European powers are going to go ahead and try to take Africa. This is the beginning of colonial history in Africa, where all of these people come together and try to colonize the continent of Africa. And so the artist is interested in that colonial history. He's also interested in the post-colonial present, which modern day Africans deal with on a day-to-day basis. But he's thinking about kind of the mindlessness of such a meeting, allowing all of these people to be completely headless, right? That's one of the parts of the piece. But he also uses in his work quite often these Dutch wax cotton fabrics, because these are kind of these fabrics, these kind of bright African prints, right? These are, when we see these in contemporary culture, we oftentimes think of Africa. These are signifiers of the African continent, these bright kind of amazing prints. We see these as, you know, in the 60s and the 70s when African Americans in America were interested in the African continent and like finding their roots in Africa. A lot of people were starting to wear Dutch wax fabrics as part of their everyday kind of garb to find those African roots. But it's interesting here because he's referencing that, but also drawing attention to the fact that these are actually Dutch fabrics, right? These are actually fabrics that were created in Northern Europe and sold to people in the African continent, taking advantage of those people, selling these in mass, and then they became these kind of signifiers of an African identity. And so there's all sorts of things happening here, but again, here's an artist who is working primarily within the craft medium. And then one last thing that I wanted to bring up in terms of fibers and crafts is yarn bombing. And so if you've ever been to kind of a big city, maybe sometimes you'll see what we call yarn bombing. This is a contemporary use of yarn and fabric, fibers, crocheting, knitting, and actually I know that in Austin there's quite a bit of yarn bombing. So basically it's similar to graffiti in some ways, because these people go out and they illegally they wrap yarn around things in public to kind of brighten the space, right? So it's similar to graffiti in some ways. And this I would also say is a type of fiber arts, right? Here we have the bull on Wall Street. This was around the Occupy Wall Street movement, where we had the bull completely covered in this yarn. And so here again we have yarn bombing taking place, where artists came out probably in the middle of the night when no one was watching, had created this fabric beforehand. They created the map. It's just like, they had a blueprint for it, and so they created the piece beforehand, and then they put it on, and then sutured it up, and then there it was, and I don't know how long it was on. It was probably taken down soon after. Similar to graffiti in many ways. But I wanted to bring up yarn bombing just as a way to bring it to the present and to bring it into some contemporary public spaces which you might have experienced.